Welcome to the 10-Minute Treasure. My name is Jeff Pospisil. And one of the questions I get from churches that are considering leaving the United Methodist denomination to join the GMC, the Global Methodist denomination, is where are we going to get our pastors? They're concerned about, first of all, if they leave, will their pastor be able to come with them? Or also looking down the road, several years down the road, what if we need another pastor? And that's a really good question. And I think that affects both denominations pretty much equally. So I'm really not comparing the two. But what I wanted to do is give you an idea of what it's like to be a district superintendent, trying to find pastors, trying to recruit pastors. So I ended up talking to my friend Roger Spahr. He's a retired pastor in the United Methodist denomination. He was a district superintendent in the Dakotas Conference. And he was really successful in recruiting. He ended up recruiting a lot of brand new pastors in, and he has a lot of good ideas about this. And so I just want you to listen to this and hopefully glean some nuggets of wisdom from Roger.
So what I wanted to do is give churches an idea of actually what it is like to recruit a pastor. And so first of all, what are you looking for when you are recruiting a pastor? What would be the person that would be a good target or a good candidate to recruit?
Well, thanks, Jeff. This is good to be on this with you. Yes, as a district superintendent, the recruiting of pastors is a big deal, especially in the Dakotas. I would say every year we knew we were going to be 6 to 12 pastors short, which in a conference our size is pretty significant. So, what I first discovered as district superintendent is most churches wanted the same thing in a pastor. They wanted someone who acted like Jesus, but thought the way they did. And if you could come up with that person, they were pretty happy, but that wasn't always the right kind of a person. And so as a superintendent, I can honestly say we tried our best to match the best available pastor we could with the church, knowing that we had a limited number, and I say available because we have a lot of pastors in the conference, but they're already connected. And so I kind of developed a little bit of a plan of here's what we're looking for and the qualities of a pastor. And so have a little bit of a word. It's lifts, L-I-F-T-S.
Okay.
That this kind of a person lifts the kingdom of God and lifts the church up, if you can find this kind of a person. And so the first is somebody with leadership and people skills. I remember John Maxwell, who does seminars on leadership, said that if you think you're leading and no one is following, you're merely taking a walk.
Yeah.
And so you kind of want somebody who can rally people. And leadership has a lot of different styles. And so it's not the same kind of leader, but to have the ability to rally people is an important thing as a pastor, and also to have some people skills that, they can relate to folks and people, and people feel comfortable around that person. The second is integrity and character. Are they teachable? Are they growing in their faith and in Christ-likeness? And what I discovered is people can interview well, but sometimes it's difficult. That there are some internal major flaws that can be there that can literally shipwreck their ministry and even shipwreck a church. And so the cabinet, we did psychological tests and all these things to try to pick those things up, but sometimes those are the hardest things to pick up because they're pretty deep bedded inside people. And the third is fire in the belly for Jesus. You want somebody with some passion for the gospel. And so that's at the core of our Wesleyan heritage, that John Wesley, it was a heart strangely warmed, and that fired up his his whole ministry. Fourth is a theological compatibility with our Wesleyan heritage. That they need to match who we are. I remember one time I interviewed this pastor, and he was a great pastor and seemed like would fit really well. But then I asked him, would you teach Wesleyan principles? And he said, no, I don't believe in it. Well, that kind of ended that discussion. We weren't going any farther. And then the last one, I just put as skills. And I put that one last intentionally because it's preaching skills, counseling skills, all those skills that you really need in a pastoral setting. Those are actually the easiest to develop in a person. If they have the other four, we can develop them into a pastor.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was looking for personally.
Kind of a follow-up question. I mean, a lot of this, I mean, those sound like excellent people. How did that deadline of June 30th affect that work? Did you ever feel like you had to compromise in a way, or how did that, I mean, what was the crunch like? Okay, we're getting to May and we still have pulpits open. We still have 3 pulpits open. Now we're getting to June and now we still have 2 pulpits open and now we're July. I mean, did you ever have to face, what was that like?
Well, we knew every year we were going to be short. It was just a matter of how many short. And so you're always recruiting. I mean, that was it. That was for me anyway. You're always trying to think. And so there were times where I remember we'd be sitting at the cabinet and we were throwing out names for various churches. Well, sometimes the same name was coming up for like 5 churches and you knew we were in trouble. And I remember several times I asked Bishop O, I said, so Bishop, you want me to go out and find somebody? And he said, if you can go find somebody, you do it. And I actually considered that a positive instead of a negative.
Yeah.
And we're going to get into that maybe a little bit more in the interview, but I just believe people are being raised up by the Lord. Jesus said, pray the Lord of the harvest to raise up laborers for the harvest. And so churches need to be praying for that. Yeah. This isn't just a job of the district superintendent and the cabinet. This is an all church on deck type thing, that we all need to be raising that up. And so I would go out and talk with some of the pastors in our district and say, do you have ideas? Do you have people that are being raised up? And we came up with some really good people that way.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So the date, it did become a crunch thing sometimes. But I think every year that I was on the cabinet, we had somebody. Not every appointment works out well. I mean, that's just a reality, no matter how big or how small the church is. Most of them worked out well.
Yeah, interesting. So getting back to it, so like, how do you actually go about, you talked a little bit about it. How do you actually go about recruiting? You did talk about reaching out. So what are the best fishing holes that you've experienced? So what are if you're fishing for pastors?
Well, I would bet most folks in the church think that all pastors are grown and raised in the seminary and then they're hatched there and then they come to us. Now that may have been true when I first came out of seminary, which is a long time ago, back 1980. Probably the majority of us, we went off to seminary, we finished our MDiv, and then we came back and said, we're ready for an appointment, send me somewhere. That's pretty rare now. We maybe get a few every year that have gone off to seminary and come back and ready to be appointed. The majority, however, are people who we placed into a church and then they are going to seminary and getting their degree. So it's more of an on-the-job type of a setting. So the fishing hole has changed, and we still send DSs to seminaries, but the pond is well fished. Let's just
Yeah.
put it that way. And so you don't get a lot of fish out of that. So it's more out of the local church that you'll have people who have been faithfully working for the Lord in that local church. You see their giftings. And so you just literally give them a call and say, would you consider pastoring a church, because you have gifts and you're showing fruit, and so that's where most of our pastors come from,
Yeah.
quite literally right now.
And what I find too, is, to some degree, I would bet you, because most of those will be second career pastors then, almost all of them, right? Are
Pretty much. Yes.
They had planned to go in a different way. I just remember talking to a couple of men that I've had in my Bible study that were second career pastors, that they received the call back when they were 18 or so, and for whatever reason they just never acted on it. They somebody spoke in their life and said, you're going to become a pastor. And for whatever reason, either they started down the path and then abandoned it, or they just blew it off. But later on, they became pastors. So it's just interesting how that happens. So,
well, especially in some of our smaller churches, we have folks who they were raised up right in that church.
Yeah.
And are doing amazingly well. And they're long-term, which my personal belief, if you can have a long-term pastor in a smaller church,
yep,
and they're effective, you are blessed.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it takes somebody who is more local, who wants to live in that area, because quite honestly, sometimes when we send somebody off to seminary who grew up in a small town in the Dakotas, and they spend 3 to 4 years in Chicago or Boston or one of the big cities, and there's a cultural change when you come back, and sometimes it just doesn't fit anymore. And so there's this natural affinity that if you don't have to send them off and we can train them now, it's a little bit like John Wesley. He believed in the lay preacher.
Yeah,
that's the foundational movement of the United Methodists.
Almost staying with the fishing analogy. I mean, it's so much easier to keep a church in a pond still alive where it grew up in versus transplanting them to anywhere. I mean, we deal with goldfish. Trying to keep them alive is one thing, just because they're not used to swimming in fluoride treated water. So anyway.
No, that's a great illustration.
So what makes DS, the district superintendent job, is multifaceted. I mean, recruiting is a piece of it, and apparently it was on your mind throughout the time. What makes for a good recruiter? I mean, because there are others that would have different strengths, such as administration or conflict resolution or whatever else, mentoring. But recruiting, what makes a good recruiting district superintendent?
Well, I would totally agree with you. When I was on the cabinet, we all had certain things that were our strength. We wanted to train pastors as preachers, and some were administratively a lot better than others. And my passion was finding new young pastors. I mean, if I could do that, I would do that forever.
Yeah.
It was my favorite thing to do. And so, it's out of the passion that I think you are the most successful in whatever you do. And
yeah.
And so, we found pastors in so many different ways. I'll give you one example that was kind of one of my favorites. It's one of the smaller churches around Sioux Falls. They were both UCC and United Methodist, and they'd had a 20-year term with a UCC pastor, so they really didn't know our system at all. And so I go in and I kind of tell them our appointive system, and do the profile and everything with the church. Well, about 3 weeks later, I find out through the back door that they've been advertising for a pastor. So in other words, they were using the UCC method, of a congregational call. So I had to go back and kind of explain to them, that's not exactly how they work. Well, found out they already had 6 people apply.
Okay.
and so rather than discourage them, I said, well, tell it, let's do a little bit of a hybrid here, and you give me your top 3. I'll sit down and interview them. And if they seem like a good fit, and we run them through the psychological tests and we do all the stuff that we do, maybe we'll find the right person. And so that's what we did, and ended up, both of us, our number 1 pick was the same person. It happened to be a clergy couple. And they're still there today and doing excellent. I mean,
that's awesome.
And she's joining the UMC, is going to be ordained as a United Methodist pastor eventually. And so the thing that I discovered is there's no one way to do this.
Yeah.
And the cabinet does not hold all the knowledge in the conference when it comes to finding the right pastors.
Yeah.
And so that's what I like to network with folks, and both inside the United Methodist Church as well as outside. I was fishing in a lot of different ponds and found some really great young pastors that way.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I mean, almost for an accountant, every problem seems like a spreadsheet can fix it. When you're a recruiter, every place looks like a fishing hole, or whatever, or at least a potential fishing hole. So
yeah.
Interesting. So I want to ask you a little bit relating to the denominational split. I remember there was really a tone change, at least in the Dakotas, around leading up to General Conference 2019, and then probably following that when we were less unified. And even actually, I remember our bishop even telling us that we were working towards a split, and it was almost hard to believe. How has that affected recruiting, or did it affect your recruiting in any way?
I retired in the spring of 2020.
Yeah.
So we had some effects of all this going on, prior to 2020. It was both COVID was starting, and we knew we were headed towards this separation. And so it did complicate things. I'm not sure it complicated during that period of time the recruitment of pastors necessarily. Our cabinet was pretty diverse theologically. And so we were continuing, reaching a lot of different pastors in that time. So I don't know that it affected the recruiting. It probably affected more the appointing. Yeah. To make sure you matched up a pastor with the direction they're going with a church that's going the same direction, so you'd have the least amount of conflict that they could. And I believe our cabinet was trying to be as fair as they could. They were trying to. They're quite honestly, there are churches who are totally split.
Yeah.
And those were the difficult ones to know what to do.
Yeah.
The ones who knew where they're going and kind of knew what their theological roots were, those were fairly easy to make.
Yeah. Just a question, this isn't in our list, but there's going to be a little bit more, I don't know, clarity about who you are as a United Methodist or as a global Methodist going forward. I think both chances, right now we have operated as a very big tent. And now I think there's going to be a little bit more distinction between the two, where before they were together. Do you think that'll help or hurt recruiting? I mean, before you could fish kind of broadly, and now you're a little bit more focused on looking for either somebody that's a UMC or a GMC pastor that's going to stay. So
I actually think it's going to make it easier. And the reason is this: people have an impression of what the United Methodist Church is, whether it's right or wrong.
Yep.
And so when you have people who may have the skills and ability, some of their experiences on both sides of the issue, they are just tentative whether that's where they want to be.
Yeah.
You know, because they know we have two divergent systems that are, you know, that there is a split coming at some point. I think most people were aware of that for a long period of time, especially if you're in seminary or you're looking at going into ministry. And so to have a little bit more clarity actually probably opens up different ponds, like you were saying.
Yeah.
And so I think it'll be easier fishing for both denominations, because you kind of know what your ponds are, a little bit easier to recruit people to it.
Yeah. And I'm guessing, again, we're calling pastors fish, but the fish will be hanging around towards the fishermen.
Some of them are fishy. Yeah, some of them are pretty fishy.
So, but yeah, they'll at least know where to look. Okay, I'm a whatever. I'm a more inclusive pastor. I get a more inclusive view. So I'm going to gravitate more naturally towards the UMC side versus I'm a more traditional view. I'm going to go ahead and gravitate towards that.
Yeah.
All right, last question, and it's if I'm a church right now, this is hopefully going out, and churches are going to be listening to this. Is what should I be doing now to make it easier, whether I'm in the UMC or the GMC, to help fill my own pulpit? What could I be doing ahead of time to help fill the pulpit?
You know, I just was talking, I do some pickleball playing, and there was this older couple from Houston. They're not part of the United Methodist Church at all, but they just went through a pastoral switch, and they're in this real large congregation. The congregation actually brought in somebody to walk with the congregation, and how do you make this transition, because they'd had the pastor they'd had for 20 years. Yeah. And now they brought in this 38-year-old pastor in this large church. And you know, and I thought there's a lot of wisdom in that, for congregations to kind of get in touch with what are our sacred cows that we don't want any new pastor messing with.
Yeah.
Because if you're not upfront with them on some of those, most pastors come in with dreams.
Yeah.
And what I've discovered sometimes is you can have an awesome pastor come in, but their dream is very different than the hopes and dreams of the congregation. And if the congregation doesn't understand that, and if they're not a little bit flexible to allow a pastor to lead, it usually ends up badly.
Yeah.
So I think congregations do need to talk about their vision, what their future is, who they hope to be in 10, 20 years. Because the reality in the Dakotas is we are going to have a lot of our churches will not exist in 10 to 20 years.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a vision beyond 10 or 20 years, then then your pastor needs to be a chaplain that comes in and helps you to die well. Well, that's a whole different gifting set than a pastor who wants to grow a church.
Yeah.
So congregations need to understand who they are, but I also think they need to be raising up the next generation of leaders, not necessarily just pastors, but you know, who are going to be the leaders in our church in the next generation. And we in my generation need to allow them to start steering the church in a way that's going to reach their generation. So and I also think we need to get away from this separation of clergy and laity. I'm all about the clergy giving up their rights.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we have put it into print that you know clergy can do this, but laity can't do that. And, and here's one of my favorite quotes of John Wesley. He says, "Give me 100 preachers who fear nothing but sin and desire nothing but God, and I care not a straw whether they be clergy or lay, such alone will shake the gates of hell and set up the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Yeah.
The reason I love that is he said, give me 100 preachers, and he doesn't care if they're lay people or if they're clergy.
Yeah.
In other words, John Wesley was using the laity to change the world.
Yeah.
And so I don't think clergy are born, they're made, and they're forged in the church.
Yeah.
And so if you want to have good pastors in the conference, you need to have good lay leaders who are trained up to be missionaries and evangelists in the local church. And if we can do that, the church is going to do just fine. We'll shake the gates of hell.
Yeah. I like that. That's probably a good place to actually leave this. I don't know unless you have any more words of wisdom, but that was really awesome. So,
well, I just want to leave it with, I'm not negative about the separation. I'm sad about the separation, but I'm also hopeful for the future, because I've been sharing these statistics. There's 12 million United Methodists in the world, but there's 80 million Methodists. And you say, well, where did all these other Methodists come from? And it's been splinters off from, the main Methodist movement, from Nazarenes to Wesleyans to Salvation Army, and you name it. There's all kinds of groups around the world, and so I would prefer to see this as birthing two new denominations rather than a splitting.
Yeah.
And that's my prayer, is that we would still consider ourselves brothers and sisters in Christ when this is all done. Yeah. So I'm optimistic about the Methodist movement. It's, I believe we're the greatest chance in America for another revival. I really do.
All right, I told you that was a pretty good conversation. I always enjoy talking to Roger, and he is just so wise. So what I'm going to do, though, is there might be some people that are, maybe you're thinking of somebody that you could push to be a pastor, or maybe you are thinking about becoming a pastor yourself. So I'm going to include a couple links, one to the Dakota's UMC and one to the GMC, of where you might at least start that process. So, and this is something, too, that every church should be praying about, praying for your next pastor as well as your current pastor, but praying for the next one as well. All right. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.